Why does it take a brilliant and articulate British author and political commentator to tell whinging Australians what they should know? I'm referring to Douglas Murray, educated at Magdalen College, Oxford, who recently made the obvious point that history is always being re-evaluated. But he then said, and I quote, "Rarely has a country had a change as abrupt and comprehensive as Australia in one generation," unquote. Now, of course, America have done a bit of this, as have Canada. But as Douglas Murray says, Australia seems to have gone most all in on a re-estimation of itself. Now, Douglas Murray alluded to the former Prime Minister John Howard's recent observation when Howard said, "The luckiest thing that happened to this country was being colonised by the British." Well, last week I made the point that I just wish the whinging and whining yes advocates like Marcia Langton and Noel Pearson would find the decency to say to hard-working, tax-paying Australians of all ilk, and I'm not talking Indigenous and non-Indigenous, I am Indigenous. An Indigenous person is a person who originated in a particular place and is a native to that place. That's you and me. Many of you listening to me were born here. We originated here. We are Indigenous. But back to the whinging and whining of so-called Aboriginal leaders. And Douglas Murray says, do you think it was on balance a good thing that the English arrived? In the case of America, would you, on balance, rather that Christopher Columbus had not set sail? Or should he, having discovered America and having returned home, should he have pretended there was nothing worth seeing out there? Until very recently, says Douglas Murray, the answer that most Australians, like Americans, would have given to such questions would have been obviously, I am glad that the country was discovered and the Europeans were among the better people to discover the land. Would the history of Australia, he says, have been better or worse if the Chinese had colonised it first? Or if the Persians had sent their prisoners to these shores? Would it have been better for America if Columbus had been a Mongol or a Hutu? Unquote. Well, the answers to all that are blindingly obvious. And yet here we are having to endure the perpetual bleatings like people, like the Prime Minister of Australia gives us, about the sufferings of Aboriginal Australians. If we were honest, we would say that not all of those sufferings have been inflicted by others. But here's a man, Douglas Murray, born in London, who said, quote, I often marvel at how much non-Aboriginal Australians, note he doesn't say non-Indigenous, non-Aboriginal Australians have been expected to put up with in recent years. Not least the endless guilt-tripping and the apologies without end, the sea of hands displays in which hundreds of thousands of Australian citizens sponsored and signed plastic hands in Aboriginal colours to sit on the lawn outside buildings like Parliament House in Canberra, the creation of a National Sorry Day back in 1998, and the signing of sorry books, unquote. As Douglas Murray, a learned POM, has said, the apologies never stop coming. He said it's now 15 years since Kevin Rudd, as Prime Minister, made his apology to the Indigenous peoples of Australia. Has any of the guilt been alleviated since then? Have the sorries washed away any blame? It seems not, he says. But then how could they? Douglas Murray then cites ethicists of the last century who've agreed that an apology can only work when it comes from someone who's done a wrong and is accepted by someone who has been wronged. If it comes from someone who themselves has done no wrong and goes to someone who has not actually been wronged, then the deal's a fraud. As Douglas Murray says, if such an apology is offered and accepted, it's a fraud on both sides. Someone who's done no wrong is pretending to be speaking for the dead, and people who've suffered no direct wrong are pretending to be able to accept an apology on behalf of people they didn't know, unquote. You see, this is the madness that Albanese and Co. and Langton and Pearson don't seem to understand. As an outsider like Douglas Murray remarks, all this, quote, doesn't seem to be getting the country anywhere because it never could, unquote. But then the disturbing guts of this issue, which applies to you, my dear viewer, because you're far too courteous. As Douglas Murray argues, quote, one thing that it does do is subdue the majority of Australians. The typical Australian no longer seems to me, says Douglas Murray, to be that striding, sensible, happy-go-lucky figure of old. They seem, he said, in my experience, to be guilt-ridden people, self-conscious to an often excruciating degree. Why? He says, well, if you browbeat any group of people for long enough, you'll get that result. A cringing, creeping through life person who subdues their thoughts and distrusts their own speech and actions, unquote. That's us. As Douglas Murray writes, This brings him back to his original question, which we all need to answer, the question beneath the debate on a so-called Indigenous voice to Parliament, because, as this British outsider asks, consider the tone in which these voice proposals are being put to us. Enter the Uluru Statement from the heart. Douglas Murray, the British academic, quotes that statement, and we should listen carefully to the language, because this stuff's being taught in schools. Listen to the language. Quote, this is in the Uluru Statement. The invasion that started, there's that word, at Botany Bay, is the origin of the fundamental grievance between the old and new Australians. The old and new. He said, this is the time, this is the Uluru Statement, this is the time of the frontier wars, when massacres, disease and poison decimated First Nations. First Nations? No nation at all. But the Uluru Statement said, even as they fought a guerrilla war of resistance, the Tasmanian genocide, this is in the Uluru Statement, and the Black War, waged by the colonists, reveals the truth about this evil time. The taking of our land without consent represents our fundamental grievance against the British Crown. By making agreements at the highest level, the negotiation process with the Australian government allows First Nations to express our sovereignty. Our sovereignty. Why does it take an Englishman to tell us that language in the Uluru Statement from the heart doesn't sound like the words of a group seeking common ground? It's based on the language of blame, victimhood and grievance. To quote Douglas Murray, a language not of equality, but of superiority. It refers to the British as colonisers, invaders, murderers and rapists, who to this day are living in a country that's not their own. Douglas Murray's not the only person who expressed bewilderment at what kind of life was so wonderful for the settlers that arrived with the first settlement, because, as he notes, many of these early arrivals died from disease. And as he notes, the Indigenous peoples were hardly a pacifist group, whatever the propagandistic history of those times now pretends. And then this, if the Aboriginals were propagated or subjugated, then they can join the club of almost every group in human history. The whole of history, says Douglas Murray, is the story of peoples rolling into other people's neighbourhoods and either succeeding or failing to conquer them. It happens to be the story of Aboriginal culture as well, where Aboriginal groups subjugated, subdued and slaughtered each other. I know that it's now de rigueur to refer to the origins of the Aboriginal communities as dream time, but there was nothing dreamlike, he writes, about Aboriginal societies. They were violent, poverty-stricken and woefully unadvanced even for their time, unquote. Are you listening, Marcia Langton and co? Writes the English author Douglas Murray, anyone who likes to romanticise that time today needs their head examined. You would have hated to have lived in those times, and nobody should kid themselves otherwise, unquote. And of you, Prime Minister, Douglas Murray has this to say to the cheers of millions of Australians, and I quote, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese may have tried to keep this whole debate as unheated as possible, but even he has been happy to say, as he did at Marrickville Town Hall in October last year, that Australian history since 1788 has been a brutal history, unquote. As Douglas Murray says, once you concede nonsense, fantasy history like this, you'll find it very hard to get your footing back, unquote. And since Albanese has said no fewer than 34 times that his government's committed to the Uluru Statement, quote unquote, in full, then Mr Albanese should know that Uluru gathering produced voice, treaty, truth. So it looks like if you vote yes, the treaty will be on the table very soon. Looking from afar, Douglas Murray says that the Yes campaign has been adept at claiming everything it doesn't like is racist. And because everything in its view is racist, including the founding of Australia, then if the founding of a country is racist, everything in it is racist. That's what we're facing. It's the most emphatic reason why Australians must, and I'm convinced they will, vote no. You can only listen to all these untruths for so long. We are now, on Saturday week, being given a chance to put a lid on them.